Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Managing Your Certification Program During the COVID Era and Beyond. Part 1, Understanding Your Future Candidate Pipeline. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer's speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees are in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them in real time throughout the course of the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded. The information contained in this presentation is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to serve as legal advice. A copy of the audio recording and slide deck will be mailed to you within 72 hours of the completion of this live presentation. And now I would like to pass the presentation over to Mark. Go ahead, Mark.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Lenora and myself, just want to thank you very much for joining us for this hour. We know everyone's time is precious, especially during the current pandemic. So we definitely appreciate the fact that you've taken a little bit of time to join us today. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the background for this web series and why we've decided on this particular topic today. We're about 6 months now into the pandemic, and much of the organizational effort that's been put forth by everyone has been really to manage the immediate response to all of the issues that have come up. You have test centers that are closed, you have stay-at-home executive orders, you have working and testing that's happening remotely, you have huge impacts on budgets, and a lot of the time has been spent dealing with those issues. Fortunately, some organizations have been able to weather the circumstances and in their words, they've gotten back to business as usual. In my opinion, though, I'm not sure business as usual is the right phrase for what we want to do as certification bodies, because as the pandemic has shown us, it's not really business as usual, it's business as unusual, right? Which is to say, I think what we need to be doing moving forward is to be managing organizations in a way that we're prepared for future disruptions or unexpected events. So that's why we picked today's topic, because candidates represent the lifeblood of certification programs. And there are so many circumstances right now that have the potential to have a significant impact on that candidate pipeline, such as record unemployment and industry upheaval. So we thought it was really important that this was something that folks were thinking about right now, and we wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. So with that, Lenora, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Mark. And I will second Mark's welcome to everybody. It's great to see such a big crowd here today. I wanted to get us started with just a few what I would call business certification back to basics. This is really just a refresher of some things that are going to be important for you as you look at how to maintain and grow your pipeline. And the first of these is knowing and really knowing your target market. And certainly the demographics are quite important for us, as well as going beyond the demographics and creating personas of our candidates and our prospects. This is enables us to get a much deeper understanding of what's going on with them, how certification can assist them, what other types of products and services that we may be able to provide to help them along the way. And way down at the bottom of the list that I have here is the WIFM, the what's in it for me, which is perhaps one of the most important things, sometimes the thing that we are perhaps a bit weaker on because we're tending to tell people what we think is important rather than looking at the personas and the career journeys and coming at it from the perspective of the prospect or the candidate. And also something that's a little bit different now that we want to incorporate in really understanding your target market is what the career journeys look like, because we're now in the age of nonlinear career journeys. And as we're talking in a bit about the impact of the pandemic, this nonlinear aspect, which was already a trend, may be amplified by COVID. So this is just good old marketing. So if you do these things, you can ensure that your messaging is going to be on point so that you'll be able to move the needle with it. This is important for crafting your value proposition in a way that's meaningful for your prospects. Also, demographics are the great tool for tracking the changes in the market. And by having this perspective on your market that you get from looking at all these aspects, you'll also be able to anticipate future needs, which is great for product development and future planning. The next business of certification basic I wanted to highlight is the certification ecosystem, which definitely contributes to the volume and also the velocity of prospects and candidates in your pipeline. And the ecosystem that you see here includes entities that serve a variety of functions. So just as an example, we have schools and professional associations and regulators which help to channel people into your pipeline. So they're marketing partners regardless of whether you formally recognize them as such or have agreements with them. They are helping to get the people into the pipeline for you. Or we could look at things like prep providers that offer programs to candidates that give them the confidence and help them to be more successful in obtaining the credential. Again, that's very important in getting people into your pipeline and not dropping out after they get started. One thing I should mention is that although I have in this schematic your organization at the center of the ecosystem universe, that doesn't mean that these relationships are all about you, of course. So when you're building and cultivating your ecosystem, it's really important to always keep in the back of your mind that the WIFM or the what's in it for me goes both ways here. And in fact, some of these entities are groups that you need more than they need you. So as you continue to foster those relationships, be keeping that in the back of your mind. And what I'd like to do, so that covers my business of certification basics. And I want to move now into talking about what you can do to maintain your pipeline in this new normal that we have. And there are three aspects I'm going to be talking about. First of which is knowing what's going on with your prospects and candidates. This is a very fluid time, and keeping tabs on this is going to be very important. Also, because of the nature of this time, meeting your prospects and candidates where they are is even more important than it's ever been. And then lastly, build out and reinforce your ecosystem. So I'm going to start with the ecosystem since we just got over talking about that a bit. Why is this particularly important now? Well, we don't know what's going to happen with the virus. We don't know whether our volumes this year are going to be predictive of next year. So essentially, we can't take anything for granted. And in a time of chaos and unpredictability, the truth is that we really all need each other more than we did before. And our ecosystem continues to be an important part of our effort to grow our program. And if you've typically not been terribly engaged in this ecosystem build out, or you haven't had the time, the opportunity, or the resources, or there's been a particular parts of the ecosystem that you haven't developed yet, this is a good time to get cracking and get engaged in brainstorming new possibilities for you. The research has shown that chaos is actually a great time to start to gain a competitive advantage and also to introduce some innovation. So, and this can be simple. I know that there's a lot of, just in our normal day-to-day lives pre-COVID, there's a lot of feeling of overwhelm just by the day-to-day operations. And planning for the future has been much more challenging. But looking at your ecosystem, just keep in mind that we can take simple steps to move forward on anything that I'm recommending today. So working with your ecosystem could be something as simple as calling the different counterparts in your ecosystem and asking, how's it going? What are you seeing? Exchanging information with each other and talking about how can we help you at this point in time. So you don't need to work on the whole ecosystem at once. Just figure out who's most important to your pipeline and get started at that point. Mark, before I go on, I think you had a few words to say on legal aspects related to this.
Yes, thanks. So, part of building and investigating that ecosystem is of course consists of having interactions with all of the different parties that are in that ecosystem. From a legal perspective, one of the areas where we see a lot of influence is with the regulators. And so, you want to be mindful of when you're having interactions with each of these categories, that there may be specific ways that you're going to need to do that type of activity. I mean, in general, right, there's usually not a problem with being out there promoting the value of certification, promoting the importance of standards, promoting the need for competent professionals. And in most cases, we think of this as a concept of advocacy. The problem with that word, though, is it's used in many different contexts, and in particular, from a legal perspective, it has very specific contexts. The interactions that you have with all of those different parties are going to be different, not only because of the nature of that party, but also of the nature of your own organization. As organizations exempt from federal income tax under the Internal Revenue Code, unfortunately, there are ways that you're going to be potentially restricted in the way that you interact with them. You go to the next slide, Lenora.
Yes.
So the majority of certification organizations and bodies are either 501c3 organizations or 501c6 organizations, and the difference between the two will have a substantial impact on the way that you're interacting with not just regulators, but also with other types of groups. If you're an organization that's classified under Section 501c3 of the Internal Revenue Code, you cannot conduct substantial lobbying activities, nor can you conduct any political activities. Okay, when we're talking about lobbying activities, we're talking about trying to influence specific legislation. In terms of grassroots lobbying, it's encouraging others to try and influence specific legislation. In terms of political activities, it's either because you feel that the candidate has a position that's favorable or not favorable to your specific activities, or whether you just want to have a political say in the matter. You're not allowed as a 501c3 organization to participate in any campaign to endorse or oppose any candidate for office. Okay, these types of restrictions don't exist for an organization that's classified under Section 501c6. Okay, normally 501c6 organizations can do unlimited lobbying, and they can do political activity as long as it's not the primary activity. So as you're going out to your ecosystem and you're having these conversations, it's important that you understand these rules, and that you have a plan, some sort of communication plan with how you're going to interact with all of these groups, so that you're not inadvertently sort of crossing these boundaries. I'll turn it back to you, Lenora.
Thanks. I'm going to move on now to talk about what's going on with our candidates and prospects. And much of it we know firsthand because we're experiencing a lot of it ourselves. We've been living through now an extended period of chaos for 6 months. And it's interesting, when I first started talking about the impact of COVID on certification, we were only about 1 month into this, and very little was really known. We know a lot more now, but it's incredible that 6 months later, there's still a lot that we don't know, both about the virus and how this is all going to pan out for our economy and for our businesses. So the chaos continues to some degree in our lives, and particularly as the virus begins to surge in other parts of the country. So just as you know, just because the Northeast managed to get things under a bit of control, next thing you know, it started someplace else. And the uncertainty that is surrounding what we're going through right now leads to anxiety and feelings of helplessness. So this is going on as well. There's also anxiety about, are we going to contract the virus and pass it along to our family and our friends or our community? And there's also fear. Now, these feelings and experiences that people are having are not just about health. They're about, how are we going to educate our children? Are they falling behind? What's happening with the economy and our jobs? Are we going to continue to be able to pay the bills and feed the family and keep a roof over our heads? So people have a lot going on in their lives right now. And so how are we going to get certification on their radar screens, given everything else, or keeping it there? Certification, if you look at what part of the brain the idea of certification occupies just in normal times versus everything else that people have going on in our lives, is like the size of a piece of sand. Now, in some respects, although people are concerned about their jobs potentially, it's even more challenging. And interestingly, ironically, this crisis is perhaps the best opportunity certifiers will ever have to build and strengthen relationships and loyalty with customers. If we do the right thing at this time for prospects and candidates and certificants, we can make a great deal of progress in our relationships with them. But I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. I wanted to talk about one other big thing that is going on with our candidates. We have, as you know, epic levels of unemployment, tens of millions just in the US that are not working. And we have to reconcile ourselves to the idea that many of these jobs won't be coming back at all, or not for a long time. And it's going to be far too long of a time for people to wait for them to come back. So not only are people unemployed, we have a large number that are being displaced. at the same time. We also have the potential that people will, by their own choice, change careers. If you think about our burnt out healthcare workers suffering post traumatic stress and folks who were making their careers in fields like culinary, which now we see can be potentially a very vulnerable industry to be working in. We also have situations with millennials who, before the pandemic, were already in financial straits, and now they're getting a double whammy with unemployment. And Gen Zs are going to be delayed in entering their chosen fields. And what we know from research from prior recessions is that once this happens, you don't ever catch up financially. So we have whole households with millennial parents and their Gen Z children that are being impacted by this long term. So for us as certifiers, there's a lot for us to be concerned about in the next few years, but also as human beings and as organizations that value social responsibility, there are a lot of things that we can do to help make things better. And there are opportunities, and I don't mean that in an opportunistic sense. I mean it in the sense of opportunities to do something good for the community as a whole and the economy as a whole. So this is where things stand. Let's talk now about meeting people where they are, given the circumstances that we have found ourselves in for the last 6 months. People need to know that you understand their circumstances. They need to know that you have empathy for them. It's not enough to understand, but have you really put the hat on of what they're experiencing? And perhaps most important of all, they want and they need to see some humanness from us. This last aspect, the humanness, might be something that as certifiers we're a bit uncomfortable about because we're standards bodies and traditionally we've tended to have more of a formal tone in our communications, but it's something that people have come to expect, and there's a lot less formality. We see into the homes of TV anchors. We have children and pets on Zoom during business meetings. So being less formal and showing the more human side is what people want to see now and has also become much more acceptable and commonplace now. Transparency is also expected. We want to know really what's going on. If we're not going to be able to test for another 6 months, why is that? Tell us and keep us informed about that. And flexibility, of course, is really important. You know, rigidity is not well received during a crisis because it makes it look like you don't care about your customers or the other entities in your ecosystem, as we were talking about. And then lastly, what people need at this time is a path forward. They need to know that there is a path forward for them and that there's something they can do to get on this path. And this is, if we take into account these aspects here, this is how we can start to build those relationships that I was talking about previously. And let's take a look at how this can be incorporated from a marketing perspective. This is something that's going to be in the toolkit that we send to you next week. So I'm not going to go into the detail of everything that's here. This is from my marketing colleague, Claire Eby from Brand Mentoring. But what the emphasis is here is on the voice of the customer. And the customer has been telling us from the beginning that we need to pivot in the way we message and market. And I think you all were able to see that in what happened with consumer products and services as this started. And what Claire has provided here is a sense of how to align your messaging with human motivations at this time. So this is going to be in your toolkit. It'll help you to get started with this. I'm going to show you an example of COVID era marketing from a certifier. And this is from the American Marketing Association. It's actually a great example. It was part of a mailing that they sent out via email. And what it does, and this is from a couple of months ago, so maybe 3 months ago. So this was quite early in this crisis that we've been going through for the last 6 months. And it acknowledges the current circumstances, but it's also softly suggesting how becoming certified now might help you on the road that's ahead. So in some ways, it's helping people to show people a path forward into the future. I'm going to pause right here because I think we'd like to take some questions if any of you have them. At this point, we'll also be having a longer Q&A at the end of the remarks that Mark and I are making today as well. Mark, have we had any questions typed in yet for us?
No questions yet, but I definitely encourage anyone to certainly at any time put in your questions, and if we don't get to them right away, we're going to try and get to them at the end of the session.
Okay. Well, so to sum up, with respect to the candidate and prospects that you've traditionally have, really what we're talking about is building out and reinforcing things that you were already doing because it's going to be more important now than ever. And also taking a different tone and a different tack in how you communicate and message people, and also understanding where they're coming from and looking at that as a way to get insights into what they may be needing in the future, and it may be something other than certification as well. So that's a summary of what to do regarding your traditional market in your pipeline. I'm going to move on now to finding and attracting new audiences, and I'm going to start
Lenora,
at the yes.
Before you jump into this next section, we did get an interesting question here. It says, what's the best way to get the voice of the customer?
That is talking to them and listening to them. So you can listen if you have a large certification program and a professional association with discussion boards, you can listen in on the types of conversations people are having. They may not be certification specific, but they may be very impactful to what you do. And listening into other forms of social media. The other is sometimes it's taking a second look at some of the comments or requests that people have made along the way and reading between the lines about what's really going on there. Just as a traditional example is when people say they want to know what to study. Sometimes that's been interpreted as they just, want to be spoon-fed. But if you step back, what it probably is really about is I, like everybody else, am really pressed for time. I'm just trying to be sure that I use my time in the best possible way because this is taking time away from my family and other things that are important to me as well. The other thing would be doing research and primarily qualitative research. Some organizations will have panels of customers that provide voices periodically as well. Was there another one?
Yeah. Let me add on to what you said too. I think, I would encourage everyone to go back to the ecosystem and touch base with every single one of those groups to the best that they're able to. When you say customer, maybe you're just thinking about the candidate that's taking the test, but the customer could also be the employer of that candidate. It could also be patients that candidate is serving. It could also be maybe the general public. So I think it's important to really have a very broad understanding of what's going on with your particular candidate in order to really understand, that quote unquote voice.
I think that's a good point, Mark. And the other thing I might add is it's less about how you get the voice of the customer and perhaps more about how to be sure that you are listening to the voice of the customer and uh, really understanding where they're coming from and then being able to act on it when it's appropriate to do so.
Yeah, so there's a related
Mhm.
question. It
Yep.
says, of the things covered regarding customers, is there one sort of theme or call to action that you should focus on when you're messaging or promoting your program to customers?
Well, I would say that at this time, it would be a message of reassurance that we are here for you and um, that we can help you on the path forward, much like what you saw in that example that I put up a moment ago from the American Marketing Association. And it's not so much about it, in some ways it's more of just saying that we're here and providing resources, and less about just trying to push out our product offerings. All right, so let's go ahead and move forward with finding and attracting new audiences. First step is going to be looking at who's out there that could be a potential new audience for our certification program. And this disruption from the pandemic has actually created some interesting opportunities for us there. And then, of course, prioritizing, because no certifier has an endless budget and resources. So, who is going to become our most important new audience for us from the perspective of viability and fit and alignment? And of course, because this is a new audience, you want to go back to those business of certification basics about knowing your customer and getting to know this new audience and why your offering is the one to help them versus anything else that's out there that they might have access to. And also finding a partner. I'm going to say a few words about this now. I'm going to start at the bottom of my list again. And I'll tell you now why I think it's important and that you have this in the it's important to have this in the back of your mind when I talk a little bit more about the first two steps. So, finding a partner or partners is important because if these are new audiences, new to your organization, you may not have an effective way to reach those people or connect with those people. So, a partner may be able to help you to do that. But the partner can also serve another purpose, which is working together with you to provide resources and offerings that these new audiences are going to need. In a minute, we're going to see that these new audiences may need to be treated differently than your traditional audiences. And they may need things that your organization can't or doesn't want to offer, but you can help facilitate or help another organization to be aware of this and get the ball rolling for this as well. And Mark, I think you've got some more legal aspects related to the partnerships that I've been talking about.
Yeah, I really like your point about there's potentially new partners out there for every organization, and I think that's something that every organization should consider. In general, it seems like the organizations in the certification world already do a good job in some ways at partnering. I mean, everybody is outsourcing one thing or the other, whether it's test development or test delivery or management of the certification program. Organizations are generally maybe already used to working with some types of partners, but the pandemic has been something that we've not seen, right, in our lifetime. So this has forced us maybe to look at sort of other new types of partnerships that are out there, if it's maybe because of a professional reason or if it's maybe due to some sort of budgetary reason. Everybody's got some sort of reason to start looking at new partners today. So that's why as you're doing that activity, I just wanted to leave you with some things to think about, 3 things specifically to think about when you're, going out and having conversations with these potential new partners. So the first thing is the area of antitrust, because standard setting in itself, it's inherently exclusionary, because the reality is, not everybody is going to be able to meet standards. But what we know is that standard setting, even though it's exclusionary, it's a widely accepted activity because it leads to positive outcomes, right? It's a generally good thing that we have competent, skilled people in the workforce. So because of those reasons, it's considered reasonable, right? And antitrust is not about sort of weeding out reasonable activity. It's really about trying to eliminate unreasonable activity. Okay, and so what is unreasonable activity? Well, it's usually covered by some sort of state or federal law, and we're not, we don't have the time to sort of go over all of the things that are potentially antitrust. What I would recommend is that before you have conversations where you're partnering with organizations related to your, to building your specific activities and not just managing them, you may want to just touch base with your legal counsel to talk about certain antitrust issues. But what I wanted to talk about today is just that there are definitely certain things that are considered per se violations, per se anti-competitive activities, and that you should, for the most part, avoid them whenever possible. So those activities are price setting. So agreeing with competitors, with other organizations to provide only a specific price to the candidate, market allocation, agreements to boycott one or more organizations, or other unfair methods of competition. And you would know that they're unfair because that facially it would be apparent. Can you go to the next slide, Lenore? Yeah, the other thing that you should consider when you're having these conversations with potential new partners are non-disclosure agreements. So non-disclosure agreements, they're useful, but they're not always appropriate, right? They used when the information is particularly candid or sensitive or preliminary. But you want to be careful when using these, because there's also other issues that would help you figure out whether or not you want to use a non-disclosure agreement, particularly the type of relationship that you have with that organization and the nature of the discussion. I mean, if you're just having sort of casual conversations with someone that you may informally know at another organization, there's no reason to have a non-disclosure agreement, right? So again, if you have a specific question on uh, when not to use these types of agreements, I'd suggest that you reach out to your legal counsel with your particular situation to figure out whether it's appropriate or not. You go to the next slide, Lenore. Yeah, the last thing I wanted to leave you with regarding these conversations with partners, potential partners, is this concept of agency. So at a very high level, right, organizations that are operating under a board generally cede the authority to operate in all manner to that board. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you want to have every single member of the board acting on behalf of the organization or even binding the organization legally in certain ways. You may even have staff, an executive director or CEO that you'd prefer to be the primary point of contact for negotiations or other types of discussions with organizations. So what you'll want to do first is you'll want to go back to your governing documents to understand exactly where the authority lies and how much authority has been bestowed on any particular role. And then, you may want to shore up if you feel that you have holes or questions come up. You may want to shore up some of those gray areas with policies and procedures to ensure that you don't have people out there acting in rogue ways on behalf of the organization, or potentially binding the organization in ways that you hadn't planned on. Finally, you definitely want to make sure you're having conversations with the board and the staff to make sure that they understand, right? Because it doesn't help to have policies and procedures in place if the folks that are subject to those policies and procedures don't know about them or haven't been notified. So it's always prudent whenever you're thinking about having external communications or having some sort of marketing plan, that you've included staff and the board to the extent that they all know what their role is in that particular activity. So I'll turn it back over to you, Lenore.
Thanks, Mark. I'm glad you mentioned some of these at this point, and particularly the antitrust, because although these are things, particularly antitrust non-disclosure, that we hear about with respect to certification, we're typically hearing about it in specific scenarios, or we have been dealing with it in specific scenarios, like for antitrust, whether to tie membership to certification. So I think it was a good opportunity for people to become more aware that as we do things that are different or with different audiences, we also want to step back and say, all right, this is different. Have we explored all the legal ramifications of it so we can operate as we need to? Next thing I want to talk about is what are the potential new audiences for your credentials. And I had said previously that some of these are new, some have been around, but this pandemic has made them even more important as new audiences. So certainly, as we've talked about, we've got the displaced worker. So these would be people that are coming from outside the field or the industry potentially, that are looking for a new opportunity to restart their professional lives. And these are the types of people I was mentioning before that may need something that's different because they are coming from the outside rather than the inside of the field as well. Gen Zs, I know many of you have been looking at Gen Zs in the last few years. They're continuing to be important. Of course, they're 61 million strong, which makes them two-thirds the size of the baby boomer generation. They entered the workforce a few years ago, and now they are back home living with their parents because they can't find jobs because of the economic impacts of the pandemic. And they're a huge force and out there, an opportunity for us, in particular because they are very focused on continuous learning and being successful in their careers. They are really a perfect match for credentialing as long as we meet them where they are in terms of the types of credentials. So Gen Z was always going to be important to us. They may be even more important now because they had an inbuilt fear of poor economic circumstances due to the Great Recession and the impact they saw that had on their parents. And so now, as you can imagine, there's high anxiety now about this because we're in situations that are even worse. And they do have an interest in credentialing and professional development. We also have older workers. This is a trend we were going to highlight in our 2020 trend report. And it's about workers staying in the workplace longer, so continuing to be in the fields that they have been in, serving as mentors for other employees, a brain trust for their employers. But now we also have older workers that have been impacted by the pandemic. Their old jobs have disappeared. So this becomes an opportunity for us, again, because these are experienced professionals, whether they come from the field or not, that they have already sets of skills, and maybe a big credential like a certification is not a good fit for them, but maybe there are some other things that could be of value to them. As a matter of fact, AARP has an article on their website about how certificates can help your career. So it's certainly something that people are aware of and starting to talk about for older workers. We've also got gig workers, and before COVID, the estimate was that about 35% of U.S. workers were freelancers. That's 57 million people. And also the research suggested that almost two-thirds of these were doing this by choice, not because they couldn't find unemployment. Well, now because of the poor economy, we have folks that have lost their regular jobs and may become gig workers. And so having a credential may be more important to them as well. But if we look at what's common to all of these groups, because this is going to help us consider what we can do to help them. First of all, if they're new groups, either new to the job market or new to the field, they're going to need to know who you are. They need a credential fast, and they may also need a way to acquire new knowledge and skills to fill in the gaps that they may need in transferring from one field to the next. And their success in this evolution or transition is going to depend on there being a very frictionless and efficient way for them to learn and obtain credentials. So attracting these audiences is really, for the most part, not going to be business as usual for you. Next up, let's talk about an action plan. We're going to be including next week in the toolkit an action plan template, but in the meantime, I wanted to give you some specific examples of what you could be doing to maintain your pipeline and engage with new audiences, just to get your thinking on this going. And the first thing is looking at how to give folks more control and confidence. And the kinds of things that you would do for this are things that are not new to certifiers. It's things like practice exams and study and review products. Now, there may be some newer things like a certification concierge that can provide a more personal contact with people when they really need this humanness, or access to what you might call certification process ambassadors that would be certificate volunteers that will help people. Also, these groups, particularly the new audiences, probably could benefit from breadcrumbs. How do I get from point A to point B in this process? You'd be surprised how many certification websites and candidate handbooks are not very clear. Um, and really, what you need to do often is to get a fresh set of eyes on these, have somebody that's unfamiliar with the process go in and engage with your content to start to get insights in this. So, we want to be clear how I do this. Think also of people that are outside of the field that didn't learn from college. Oh, by the way, there's this certification when you graduate, and this is what you need to do to be able to earn it. Also, let's give them access to resources that could help them. It doesn't have to be our resources, but let's give them an easy way to find resources that will be helpful to them entering the field, and maybe maintaining some regular contact and checking in with these folks as part of that. We've got to also find ways to be flexible. I spoke about this very much in the beginning. These are different circumstances, different audiences. We're likely going to need to do things differently. And that may be things like giving up the idea that every initiative has to be perfect, and instead aim for what's just good enough, because people need help now. They can't wait for the perfect to come. When we talk about our displaced workers, here's some homework you can start to do. Look for industries that have been heavily impacted and the job roles within those industries. And you may find jobs which require similar abilities and skills to the roles that you're certifying. So, for instance, a restaurant manager may be a good fit for a career in logistics. People in consumer retail could be good candidates for help desk roles. Now, will these people be ready to certify right off the bat? Probably not, but this is where having on ramps and partners can be useful for that process. And then, just lastly, another idea which I've already alluded to is you may find that other types of credentials, micro credentials or certificate programs or something else are needed to bring workers into the field and to keep your current market up to date as well, and to remain competitive in the job market. With all this unemployment, even those staying in the field face a lot of competition now in the job market. And my last word that I wanted to say before we take more questions is just be thinking about doing small things at a time. Again, it doesn't have to be the big initiative. And those of you that are fans of What About Bob, the movie, will recognize this picture and this idea. So there's a lot that we can do that is pretty straightforward and relatively easy to do to get the ball rolling on what we've talked about today. I'll pause there, and I see that some notes that we do have questions in, Mark. I can't see them, but maybe you can take a look.
Yeah, so let me, there was one comment that came through first, and I thought this was, it made sense to address it because in your last slide, particularly the bullet point about displaced workers, there's a comment here talking about how credentialing is potentially a chicken and egg situation where sometimes you need experience first before being able to get the credential. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, in the current circumstances, I mean, it's probably going to be a lot harder for someone to get experience. And having, you know, sort of pivoting to a target pool of displaced workers, somebody who may have relevant experience, but not necessarily the exact experience, that's potentially one way, I think, to address that that scenario. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, I would say for, let's say, potentially the longer term, the next year or so, it may be providing a way, not that you have to provide it, but linking people with apprenticeships or internships or other types of work experience that they can get through employers. Maybe you're able to set up a database for that you can connect people with. And this feeds back to maybe they're going to need something other than certification in the beginning. Maybe they need a different type of credential that you could create that will get them started on the path that they need to follow.
Okay. Here's another question. What is the what does business as usual mean for certification?
That's something I would love to throw back to the audience.
Yeah, I think I'm the one that brought up the phrase, and when the context that it was used in some of the other conversations that we've had, to me it sounded like just doing the exact same thing that the organization was doing before the pandemic hit. And I'm not sure, even if you wanted to, you could go back to that specific scenario. So that's why I'm throwing out the phrase business as unusual, because not only is your business going to look different because of the pandemic, but I think it's going to have to look different in order to be prepared for future disruptions and other types of unexpected events.
I agree, and I think people's expectations are now different as well. For instance, I think to some degree the genie is out of the bottle on live remote proctoring now that people have experienced it, and certifiers have had an opportunity to implement it, and in many cases had a good experience with it.
Yeah. Okay. Another question we have, do you see any movement towards credentialing organizations contemplating mergers?
We were seeing some of that before the pandemic. I haven't specifically heard anything about that post pandemic. The other thing that we were seeing, a few instances, but enough to think that there might be something happening there, are the parent organizations, most typically the professional associations, trying to take back the independent certification program, and when finding that they can't or can't exert control over it, creating their own competing credential.
Yeah, I also have not seen any significant activity in this area. I think it is an option, though. It's a viable option for organizations that are particularly feeling some sort of budgetary crunch. But not everybody can be a partner for many different reasons, especially whether or not your missions sort of coincide, because you have to, again, operate in furtherance of your tax exempt purpose. So, there's a lot of things that would impact the decision, obviously, to merge with another organization, but I think that is a viable option for some. We have one last question. It says, how is testing being conducted during the pandemic? So I know that at least with some of the folks that I've been working with, they've been doing it both via remote testing and in the testing centers.
This is Mark and I host community conversations on a bi-weekly basis. I have been doing that since the beginning of April, and many people shifted over to live remote proctoring. Some are so satisfied they're going to stay there, and we do have people that are still testing through centers. both situations, there has been some backlog, but the community is telling us that that's starting to clear quite a bit over the last month or so. And I think we've got just 1 minute left, Mark.
Yeah.
Did you want to tell folks about the next two parts of the webinar series, or are we going to keep that a secret?
Sure, no. So yeah, again, thanks everyone for joining us today. This is the first of a planned 3-part series. Again, the goal is to just generally be a resource for you moving forward in this COVID-19 pandemic. So part 2 is hopefully going to occur sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks, and then part 3 also within that type of time frame. And in part 2, we're going to try and address more of the day-to-day operations and making changes that would make sense in terms of preparing for future disruption.
And just being more agile in general, which we should have all been working towards before this as well.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Mark and Lenora, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Managing Your Certification Program During the COVID Era and Beyond. Part 1, Understanding Your Future Candidate Pipeline. On behalf of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and stay well.